And it took years for my parents to understand this, but your mother and your grandmother, when they put on a charm offensive, there was not a lot of defenses, and they decided
No one stood a chance. Yeah.
they were going to convince my father, who was very reluctant. My father wrote me a 5-page, single-page, and it took years explaining to me exactly my why parents this was such a bad idea. Your mother and your grandmother, he said, I will. When they put on a charm offensive, if I married a Catholic, there was not a lot of difference in my own household. I understood years later he was saying he feared that he would always be a stranger. But as we spent so much time just trying to convince him that, I was not making a mistake, I wrote him a letter back and I said, Dad, I understand everything you're saying, but there's one difference between us. I'm in love and you're not. And eventually he fell in love. Eventually he came to embrace your mother. At one point he said to me, Stephen, it would be so much easier to oppose this match if it wasn't so obvious she's the perfect girl for you. And I knew it was going to be okay.
And so you got married in 1966. That was a circus, 1,500 guests and a priest and a rabbi and the president of the United States. Welcome to the family.
Yeah, just an intimate family gathering.
And you moved to New York because you were on the city desk for the New York Times.
Well,
what were those early years, right?
Yeah, and Mom was already a TV star in a way. I mean, she was hosting her own show on the local NBC station. A lot of people don't realize this, but her first job out of college, she's worked for a small TV production company, and the woman who ran it was the first of many TV producers to realize that the camera loved Cokie Boggs. And they started this small show. It was called Meeting of the Minds. It was on NBC. In fact, here in Washington, it was the lead-in to Meet the Press. And Mom was the host, and she's 22 years old. And it was a measure of life in 1966, 67, that we just assumed that my job would be more important. And we didn't even have a conversation. Maybe the fact that she was actually running her own TV show, maybe that was more important. She moves to New York and she runs into a wall of discrimination. Now, this is a woman who wrote 5 national best-selling books, and she was told flat out by Newsweek magazine and many other people, we do not hire women to be writers. I think after those 5 bestsellers, she proved them wrong. I'm just saying, right? But at the time, it was deeply depressing, and she tells this wonderful story of just to illustrate how deeply depressed she was and how frustrated, how she could barely wake up and get to just get dressed. And one day she said, I have my pathetic, her words, pathetic little tasks that I would do every day just to get out of the house. And she had a wedding present that she wanted to return. And so she goes to this store on the east side of Manhattan called Jorg Jensen, big fancy store. And as she told the story, she couldn't quite have the energy to get dressed. So she put on her coat over her nightgown and goes to across town and goes to the store. And she's standing there online. And to her horror, realizes that the guy of the couple who was giving us the wedding present she's returning is standing on the line in front of her. Now, 8 million people in New York City, and this guy is standing in front of her. And she thinks, but it's the guy. He has no clue what the present is. So maybe I'm safe. And he gets to the front of the line. There's some question about what he's returning. He calls his wife, says, hey, guess who I ran into? His wife starts laughing, says, put Cokie on the phone. She says, because she knew exactly what the present was that she was returning. Says, what are the odds, right? So our friend Terry says to Mom, no hard feelings here. He was a New York Times reporter. He was about to cover Governor Rockefeller swearing in his new term. He says, come with me to the Rockefeller swearing. It's actually not far from here in Manhattan. So Mom, in her nightgown, with the coat, says, okay, Terry. And they show up, and it's all of these hot TV lights, and everybody's saying, ma'am, can we take your coat? And she's, no, I'm from the South. I'm always cold. I'll keep my coat. And so she stays through the whole ceremony, and then Terry's being very nice to her and says, well, how about I'll take you to lunch just to show no heart. And at that point, Mom says, no, 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 Terry, I'm going home. Enough of this charade. But, it was hard on her. And she was genuinely depressed. And it wasn't really till 11 years later, when we returned to Washington, that she became a full-time journalist.
But that wasn't, I mean, she didn't take a big break between then, right? You all moved to LA. She produced a children's television show. We as a family together moved to Athens, Greece. And that's when she first kind of became a breaking news journalist. Tell that.
Well, that's true. She decided that, she couldn't produce children's shows in Greece. So she decided to try to hook up with one of the networks, and had this agreement with CBS that maybe they'd use her, the phrase as a stringer, as a part-time reporter. They already had a reporter in Athens, but maybe they'd find a little work for her. We're there for only 3 months, and there's a coup in the island of Cyprus, part of my territory. And so every journalist from that part of the world flies to Cyprus about a day or two after the coup. And as a result of the coup back in Athens, the military government, where there's a military government in Athens, starts crumbling. Now, that was a much bigger story. Greece is a NATO country, the decline of the military government. And she was virtually the only English language reporter left back in Athens. So CBS cables her and says, the Turks have, and then as a result of the Cyprus coup, the Turks invade Cyprus. And so that morning, 2 days after I'd left, she gets a cable from CBS saying, the Turks have invaded Cyprus. Can you file a radio spot in 30 minutes? She had never done a radio spot in her life. She figures out how to do it because, she was smart. And then the Greek government falls. And she's covering this whole story because CBS can't get anybody into the country because the airports have all closed. Now I'm totally out of touch with her because I'm on the island of Cyprus. I'm under fire. There's a war going on. If I could occasionally get a phone line, I had to talk to my editors in New York. I come home back 8 days later to find I'm married to a veteran foreign correspondent. When I had left, she had not done a radio report in her life. 8 days later, she'd been filing continuously. So yes, that was really her first breakthrough.
And we were there 3.5, 4 years?
3.5, yeah.
And then moved back to Washington. Which was not Mom's choice, it must be said. For someone who lobbied her children very hard to come back to Washington, she resented that move herself.
But it worked with you.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, it was because for a lot of reasons. This was where she had grown up. This is where she was Helen Lindy Boggs' daughter. She was not as independent. Even though she had had that success with CBS, she was very nervous about entering the job market here in Washington. I mean, she was 33, turning 34 years old. She had never been a full-time working journalist in her life. And she loved living abroad. And she kept saying, I'm a really good foreign correspondent's wife. Let's go. And she was always more adventuresome than I was. And New York Times wanted to send us to Bangkok. And she was all for it. And I said, I'm tired. I've been traveling for 9 years, and I got a chance to join the Washington Bureau. So we came home. And my first day here in Washington, I go to the Washington Bureau of the Times. I look around, I'm given a desk, and there's a young woman sitting at the next desk. I don't recognize her. I say, hi, I'm Steve Roberts. She says, my name's Judy Miller. I said, I don't recognize your byline. Where did you used to work? She said, National Public Radio. And I said, what's that? Because it had been in existence for 6 years, but we had been abroad for 4 of those years. And she tells me, and I said, wait, that's the perfect place for my wife to work. I just know it. What do I do? She's crying herself to sleep in Bethesda every night. And Judy says, call my friend Nina Totenberg, who, of course, to many of our folks tuning in tonight know exactly who Nina Totenberg was then and is today, the Supreme Court correspondent of NPR. I'd never met her. I call her up, and she says, I know who you are. I know who Cokie is. And bring me her resume tomorrow. And so I hurry over there the next day, meet her on the street corner outside of the NPR office. And in fact, this was the first time I had seen the old girls network at work, where women at NPR had the ability and the impulse to help each other in the way men had always done this for each other. And Nina takes her resume and immediately starts pushing it through the NPR system. Linda Wertheimer is there and says, wait, I know who that is. I went to Wellesley with her. And the two of them put the hard press on, and that's when NPR hired her.
Do you think NPR was distinctive in its hiring of women in those days?
Absolutely, without a question. Now, Nina always said because they paid so little, and that certainly was part of it. But there were two other reasons. I worked 3 blocks away at the New York Times Bureau. There have been white male White House correspondents for the New York Times for 100 years. It was a deeply encrusted prejudice and assumption about what a White House correspondent looks like and sounds like. And it was a white guy, right? But for NPR, they were new, they were nimble, they could reinvent themselves in different ways. And so they didn't have anything like the same prejudices. But there's another interesting reason, which the producer at NPR told me, that, on TV, it's easy to distinguish genders and it's easy to distinguish voices. But on radio, if you have a bunch of male voices, it's much harder if there's a conversation for the audience to know who is who. So that by putting women on the panels and in the conversations, people had a much better idea of the identity of each person who was talking. And so there was, just from a production point of view, there was also that impulse to add women at NPR.
Mm-hmm. And, I feel like those years, the 80s mainly and 90s, NPR was growing in scope and loyalty and reach, and mom was falling in love with the medium of radio. And I think they kind of grew up together in some ways,
Sure. She fell in love with radio, as did you at another point in your life. She always loved radio because she felt it was a great storyteller's medium and a great writer's medium. TV, it's a cliche, but it's true. You're so overwhelmed by the visuals, by the images, and any of us who have been on radio and TV, this, I know this. If someone stops you and said, "Oh, gee, I saw you on TV," and you say, "Oh, cool," and they'd say, "Yeah, I like your tie," or "You need a haircut," or,
right.
And if someone says, "I heard you on radio," they quote back to you big chunks of what you said. There's an ability to make so much more of a sophisticated, complex argument. First of all, you have more time, right? If you're on TV, you get a minute and a half. A spot on NPR will be 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes. But also, it's the nature of radio. There's only one sensory input. People listen to the words, and as Mom always said, they create the pictures in their head. And that's one of the reasons why she stayed loyal to NPR her whole life. Even after she moved her base to ABC, she loved being on NPR every Monday morning because she knew that she could make arguments and analysis there that she couldn't really even do on TV.
Mm-hmm. I think she was always a really good writer, but I think it makes you a better writer too, because you can't have a lot of dependent clauses. You can't lose your antecedent, right? Because people they lose the thread if they can't go back a sentence and check. And so when Mom started writing books and trying to bring history alive in this very vivid and approachable way, I think that radio training came through in all of those books. Absolutely,
because she was such a clear writer and also such a passionate writer. There's a clear arc that runs through almost everything she did back, and that was supporting, promoting, encouraging women in one form or another. So there's a direct line between that line of young women outside her office door seeking counsel and encouragement and her focus on women in history. But one of the reasons why she was so sensitive to that and interested in it, because she grew up with it. Your grandmother, her mother, was the modern incarnation of Dolly Madison. Mom even made that comparison when she said, my mother reminds me of Dolly Madison, or the other way around, because she saw right in front of her all these enormously talented and powerful and important women in Washington whose influence derived from being the counselors and advisors of their husbands, whether it was Lady Bird Johnson, Betty Ford, Pauline Gore, the wife of a senator, the mother of a senator and vice president. She saw them as her mother's pals, and she saw the influence that they had. And that made her, Lady Bird Johnson was the modern equivalent of Abigail Adams in the same way. But of course, what happened to your grandmother when your grandfather Hale, Cokie's dad, was tragically killed in a plane crash in 1972, suddenly your grandmother runs for his seat and moves from backstage to center stage. And there's a wonderful story in the book where she calls her lifelong friend, Lady Bird Johnson, and says, Bird, I've just decided I'm going to run for Hale's seat, and I want you to know that before you read about it in the paper. And Mrs. Johnson says, why, darling, Lindy, that's a wonderful idea, but how are you going to do it without a wife?
So Mom's father, my grandfather, Hale Boggs, was a member of Congress. My grandmother, Lindy Boggs, was a member of Congress. My uncle, Tommy Boggs, Mom's brother, ran for Congress and lost. My aunt, Barbara Boggs Sigmund, lost for Congress, but was elected mayor of the town of Princeton. Do you think Mom ever regretted not running for office?
Yes. And she described herself as semi-guilty.
I don't know what that means.
I think, whatever that means. I think if she had married someone else, I mean, she always said, I became a journalist because I married one. And she said, Stephen was going to be a journalist from the time he was 12, which is true. And that once we were committed to each other, politics was off the table. I couldn't run for office. I was married to a journalist. I think she always felt that journalism, quite rightly, was in fact a form of public service. But it wasn't the kind of direct advocacy that she always really wanted to do. Now, she never did run for office, never became a political partisan, but she made a very conscious decision at one point in her life to retire from the anchor desk at ABC. She was running the Sunday show for 6 years. She left that show for a lot of reasons. Maybe the single biggest reason was that she really did want to be an advocate for causes she cared about. And again, this bright line that runs through everything she did. The woman who wrote these best-selling books about women in history also wanted to be an advocate for women and children. And she joined the board of a wonderful organization called Save the Children. She traveled the world advocating for women and children, learning about their programs, a spokesman for their causes. And she was always particularly committed to the notion of keeping girls in school in developing countries. She felt this was always the key. They put off getting married, they developed a marketable skill, they were independent people, they had an economic basis, just everything good flowed from keeping girls in school. And I remember once, she went to Malawi to open a school that Save the Children had helped finance. And she did this all over the world because, she just believed so deeply. Her friend Diane Sawyer, former ABC star and also a graduate of Wellesley, once said, I quote her in the book, I think Cokie believed women would save the planet. And that's right. She did believe that.
But of course, did it entirely in her own way. Actually, it's one of my favorite memories. I ended up going to Vietnam with Mom on a Save the Children trip. I had finished grad school and was about to start a new job and had this sort of unusual time when I could go halfway around the world. And we took these terrifying vans up and up and up and up, almost to the Laotian border, to a Hmong village where there was a Save the Children funded school. And you just can't imagine how remote this was. And it was really muddy. So you're on a steep hill in the middle of nowhere in ankle deep mud. And the rest of us are all in, athleisure and sensible shoes. Mom's in a linen pencil skirt and little strappy sandals and is picking her way through the mud of this Hmong village. And absolutely, joining in the classes and having her picture taken with all the girls, and it just couldn't be more enthusiastic or more on task, but she was not going to wear ugly clothes while she did it.
No, and I think that was the time when, because she was so muddy, Carolyn Miles, who was on the trip, tells a story that she started jumping up and down to get the mud off her shoes. And the little kids thought this was about the funniest thing they'd ever seen, this crazy American lady jumping up and down. So she kept doing it. She kept jumping up and down because the kids kept laughing. But yeah, some of my favorite images, and there are a couple of them in the book, of her and her affection and her joy at being there with these kids is just so tangible. It just comes right through.
Yeah. You know, we've talked a lot about successes and happy times and the joy that mom was so capable of and capable of spreading. But her life was certainly not without hardship. Her father died young and in a very difficult, hard way. He was lost in a plane crash. Her very beloved sister was the age I am now when she died. And you were there for all of that. Tell us a little bit about mom weathering losses.
Well, it's true. Her dad disappeared, in a plane crash. And I don't think she ever fully got over it. She was the baby. She was his favorite. I think she deeply mourned the fact that, you were 2 years old, your brother was 4 when your grandfather died. And you have no memory of him. And that pained her always, that not only that you wouldn't know him, but he wouldn't know you. And I also think that I thought a lot about this. I think that it pained her not out of pride so much, but I think she knew that he would be really proud of her, because he spent his life devoted to the U.S. Congress. He was member of Congress for 30 years. He was the majority leader when he was killed. He probably would have been speaker if he had lived. And she revered the Congress. She was a correspondent there, but it was more than just reporting about Congress. She was on the, not only on the National Archives Board, but on the Congressional Historical Society. She was deeply devoted to respecting the institution. She and I covered Congress together for most of 8 years, from 78 to 86. I was at the New York Times then, and she was at NPR, and would commute together, would have lunch together, cover the same stories. And when we would leave at night, in those old days, you could, if you were a reporter, you could park your car right on the grounds of the Capitol, and we would go to our car, and she never failed to do this. She'd look up at the dome, and if it was night, it would be lit up. And she would just say, "Isn't that beautiful?" And she didn't just mean it was beautiful because of the site. It was because of what it symbolized. So I think she really deeply regretted and mourned the fact. And her father's death, it was so, as you say, it was so odd because he was lost in a plane crash and the body was never found. The plane was never found. Wreckage disappeared. We think it probably sank into a Prince William Sound, but she had this, she would say this, and I quote her in the book, how she had this absolutely strange impulse that maybe someday he'd come back. And of course, we lived in the house that she grew up in. So she said for years, I couldn't bear to change the wallpaper in the kitchen because I had this fear that Pawpaw, as we called him, Pawpaw would come back somehow. And if the wallpaper was different in the kitchen, he'd think there were strangers living in the house. I mean, that's borderline weird, right? But
So it was really ugly wallpaper.
Yeah, really ugly wallpaper. But so it was very emotional. Her sister, in some ways, was even more. I mean, sister was only 51, as they say how exactly how old you are now. You, of course, knew this story very well. You were an undergraduate at Princeton when Barbara was the mayor of Princeton, and you helped nurse her through her last year. She died during your junior year in college. And in her last year, as her cancer took hold, you were a wonderful caretaker for her. Mom would, get there as much as she could. And the night Barbara died, she held her in her arms after she died and sang to her in the middle of the night till dawn broke. And she had to deal with the doings of death. But she, and I don't think she ever got over her sister's death either. And she once wrote about this. Didn't do it very often, but she once wrote about this in a little note she wrote for a Wellesley book, that classes publish, where members of the class will write little memories. And she writes in this book, it never occurred to me that I wouldn't grow old with my sister. And I always pictured us sitting side by side on these rocking chairs and in some porch somewhere. And she said the image of Barbara's empty chair, haunts me. And it was more than that, because she said, as the younger sister, I always went to Barbara if I had a question, what really happened? She said, Barbara was part of my memory. She was part of my identity. And when you lose someone like that, you lose part of yourself. You lose part of your own memory. You don't have anybody to go to ask questions. And she and Barbara shared a view of the world. They had very little tolerance for male pomposity, including in their husbands, by the way, but also kind of strange things people did. And Mom tells a story about one day reading a story about elderly women in their 50s trying to get pregnant through IVF. And she just thought that was the kookiest thing she could imagine. And she literally picks up the phone to call her sister to have a laugh over it. And as she's dialing her number, realizes she's not there. So, yes, her life was definitely marred by those two tragic losses.
Mm-hmm. I will say, and I don't know if it was because of those losses, but Mom was really good at death. That's a strange thing to say, but not only did she advocate for doctors, not acting like gods and helping people through a good death, and making sure that her mother, who was 97, was able to be home and surrounded by everyone she loved. But also, Mom is why I don't let a friend go to the funeral home to pick out a casket alone. She was always the one who managed the details of things, told people what they needed to know, made sure those awful, awful errands were okay, and that she was by someone's side. She had a couple of things she was an incredibly devoted friend, but there were a couple of things that she would always make sure she was there for: babies, oncology, and funerals.
Absolutely. And her dear friend Nina Totenberg tells a story. It's in the book. Nina married a much older man, Floyd Haskell, the former U.S. Senator. He's 26 years older than Nina. She always knew the odds were that she would have to bury him. And he struggled through a number of illnesses. Mom went with Nina to all of the appointments with the doctors, all through Floyd's illnesses. He had fallen, hit his head. She was the one. She always said, when you're in those situations, you're not thinking clearly. You need someone with you to take notes and ask questions. And then Floyd died, and he died in Maine, and they had to ship his body back to Washington. Enormously complex and traumatic, different circumstance. And Nina said, direct quote, Cokie managed Floyd's death, and she just took it over. And then finally, after helping to get him buried at Arlington and all these things that she did, it came to picking out a casket. And Nina tells the story, tells it in the book, that they're looking at these caskets, and Nina's this white-faced, obsequious character at the funeral home is trying to sell her a more expensive version. And she says to her, Ms. Totenberg, your husband was a very tall man, so he'd be more comfortable in this casket. And Nina and Cokie look at each other and burst out laughing. Now, you got to be, as Nina said, you got to be a pretty darn good friend to share a laugh over your husband's casket. But that's exactly what they did. And she was there. She was there for funerals. There's another story that a friend of hers tells, an African-American woman whose brother died. And Cokie had been a counselor to this young woman, taking care of a child who was not her own, and trying to work, trying to go through college. Cokie was there every step of the way counseling her. And then Sonia's brother dies, and there's a funeral at a big downtown black church in Washington. Sonia describes the scene at the middle of the day, and in walks Cokie. She's the only white person in the church. She walks down the aisle. Everybody's looking at her. She walks down the aisle, comes to the family in the front, and embraces Sonia's mother. And Sonia said it was like my two moms embracing, and she was never afraid of it. She never flinched from those tragic moments, because she knew that people needed someone at their side at those moments.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. Somebody asks, where did Cokie get all that joy and all that selflessness?
Good question. I try to answer that question in the book. A couple of the answers. One was her faith. She lived the gospel. You trace her generosity of spirit directly to her religious training by the nuns of the Sacred Heart. She believed what she was told as a young girl in catechism class. Every person is fashioned in the image and likeness of God. I'm not going to get the quote right, but she believed that, and she lived it. I think her faith was very important. And the nuns hammered home to her the adage, to whom much is given, much is expected. And she absolutely embraced that, lived it, and practiced it.
To us, yeah.
And I think some of it came from her mother, who was very much the same way, who set a great role model for her. Cokie always said, mothers of my mother's generation were often guilt inculcators. My mom was the great guilt eraser. She always, said, you're going to be okay. You can do all of these things. I think also another very important element was her sense of continuity with women. She was this fascinating combination of radical and traditionalist at the same time. No one fought harder for women's rights. No one promoted women more ferociously at ABC or anywhere ever she was. And yet she always said, no matter what we do, no matter how far we come, no matter how visible and celebrated we are, and how successful professionally, we cannot, as women, forget who we really are and what our historic missions have always been, to be the nurturers and the caretakers and the mothers. And she had a great sense of that continuity. And I think that was part of it too, that she wanted women to understand that you could be both. You could be both an enormous professional success, but don't forget what the essence, the basic nature we have as women.
And in terms of that joy, I would also add, first of all, she had a wonderful group of friends. She was a very good friend, but also, absorbed the support and, camaraderie of wonderful, wonderful friends. And also a wicked sense of humor, right? So I think that ability to see the strange and absurd in almost every situation keeps that true selflessness and decency and desire to be good from tipping on into sort of deadly earnest, because while she was doing all of that, she was also poking fun of herself and everybody else.
Oh, absolutely. And
you mainly.
And me mainly, absolutely. We did a book about our interfaith marriage many years ago. And we originally thought that we would write it in one voice, and we couldn't do it because we disagreed so much. And so we wound up doing it in dialogue form, and we would tape, talking to a tape recorder. And I would tell stories and say, Stephen, that's not how it happened. And we kept that all in the book because it was so typical of her. And she did not rest easily with male pomposity, as you say, particularly her husband's. And I learned that. And one of the moments I learned this, she had written many years before, because she joyfully, even as a devout Catholic, joyfully embraced my Jewish heritage. And in fact, my mother often said the first Passover Seder she ever went to, my Jewish mother, was at her Catholic daughter-in-law's house. And so Cokie decided she was going to write a Haggadah. This is the book that the Passover service is written in. The prayers, the stories, the symbols are all contained in this book. And that's how you conduct the service, by using this book. So she decided, of course, if she was going to be serious about this, she was going to write her own Passover Haggadah, because none of the ones she sampled were good.
Thousands of years of tradition, unacceptable.
Thousands of years. She was going to write her own, and because she wanted one that was crafted with an eye toward our interfaith marriage. Anyway, she writes one. We use it in the family, as you well know, for many, many years, sanctified by wine stains and food stains. And then it was just on mimeograph paper, and then people, after 25 years, republished it, but still, it was just in the family. And some editors, Jewish Book World, hear about this and say, well, you should really publish this as a book. So great, we decide that's a good idea. So we start editing it. And I start reading it and I think, well, this could use some freshening. And she's furious with me. I mean, absolutely furious. And she says, you cannot change a word. This is sacred text. I said, oh. Now I did not stay happily married to your mother for 53 years by ignoring her at those moments of extreme adamancy. So, yes, darling, whatever you say, dear. Then she starts editing it. And I said to her, wait, Cokie, you said I couldn't change a word. And she said, that's right, Stephen. I said, you couldn't change a word. But because I wrote it, I can change anything I want. Very typical. And we came to a detente and we both edited. But, you know, she laid down the law. But with a smile. And that laugh back, I can't tell you how many people I talked to said that the best part about listening to her on television was her laugh. And there was one writer who really understood her pretty well in a magazine profile said, watching Cokie on television, you think fun is about to break out somewhere. Great laugh.
Someone in the audience has asked, what was Cokie's favorite job?
Mother. I mean, without question, right? Without question.
I mean, grandmother, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe grandmother. Absolutely. She says, you know, from the time, and I can tell you, from the, maybe 10, 15 minutes into our marriage, she started lobbying for a baby. Took a couple of years, but she loved being a mother and she loved being a grandmother. And I think she would say that. You asked her that question, that's exactly the same answer she would give. I will say, you asked about regrets. And, you know, when she died, her oldest grandchild was 18. You know, your boys were still in high school, and one still is. And I think her deepest regret, as the illness took hold, and as she could see her mortality becoming more and more tangible, was not being able to see the grandkids grow up. That was by far her single biggest regret. Because she loved being a mother and grandmother so much. She would travel with them. You know this. She took one of your boys to Maine once, and he's never gotten over it. One of your twin boys, who now, you know, is 20 in college, but she made him carry home live lobsters.
Well, the whole thing is so wacky. He was like 14, and she called him up one day and said, I have to be in Maine for 24 hours. Come with me, which was classic Grandma Cokie, right? Who knows where she was going or why she had to be in Maine for 24 hours, but she was going to be bored without company. So she called up teenage grandson and said, hop on a plane with me. And he, you know, trailed her to whatever events and made all the polite noises at, you know, the reception she had to attend. And then it was time to go home. And she blocked a box of live lobsters on his lap and told him it was his job to take care of them.
She loved traveling with the grandkids. You know, she took every one of them to the White House Christmas party one year or another, and took your youngest, Roland, to Maine, and where we got to meet President Bush, 41, just a month or two before he died. So she loved showing them off, but she loved just being with them. You know, her youngest grandchild, you know, your niece, Cecilia, when we were at the beach all together, our beach house in South Carolina, they had a deal where they would watch the big red ball, and they would both get up really early and watch the sun come up out of the ocean together, the big red ball. You know, she found some connection with each one of them separately.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any risk that they won't remember her well and fondly. We are almost out of time, Dad, but I want to just give you one chance to sort of say what you hope people will take from this book and encourage them to buy it. I will encourage them to buy it on your behalf.
Well, it's really very simple. As I said earlier, not everybody can be the public Cokie. Not everybody can be famous. Not everybody can be recognized in the grocery store and the airport. everybody can be a good person. Everybody can learn something from her. And one of her friends said to me, one of her best friends, when I think about Cokie, I'm not going to get one of those bracelets that says WWJD, what would Jesus do? I'm going to get one that says WWCD, what would Cokie do? In fact, there's a hashtag now, WWCD, that I've noticed several of my former students are circulating. And the story that ends the book, as I was writing this book about a year after Mom died, my younger brother Glenn died, and I knew he was fading, and phone rang at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was my sister-in-law saying we lost him overnight. But now you can go back to bed. And I sat there literally with the phone in my hand, saying to myself, what would Cokie do? And I knew. I got up, got dressed, and started driving to my brother's house, which was about 15 minutes away. I called my sister, and I tell her that I'm going over there now because that's what Cokie would want me to do. And that's what Cokie would have done. And she said, Stephen, you have it wrong. Cokie would have been there last night sleeping on Glenn's couch. So later in the day, I talk to your brother, and I tell him this story, and he says, Dad, you're both wrong. Mom would have been there the last 3 nights sleeping on the couch. Well, what would Cokie do? If you just read this book and ask that question, you learn something wonderful.
I agree. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for joining me for the last hour. And thank you, everyone in the audience. And thank you to the archives for having us.